The contextualization of our faith traditions is important because it helps to make it relevant to those who listen.
But assimilation can threaten the integrity of the core truths of a religious identity.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here is your host and moderator.
Welcome, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andrea Luxton. I am the president of Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and I am today's moderator. Before we get into what will be an interesting topic, I would like you to meet our panelists.
My name is Mel Robeck. I'm Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. I'm also an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Dan Levin. I serve as Senior Rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
And I'm Tom Plumley. I'm the Senior Minister at First Christian Church, Fort Worth, Texas. We're a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Welcome to our panelists, and now to today's topic. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is a remote Chilean territory in the mid-Pacific. The inhabitants, the Rapa Nui community, are mostly Catholic, but its religious practices are intertwined with its ancestral beliefs. For example, the musical themes sung during Mass narrate biblical passages translated to the Rapa Nui language. The physique and legacy of the islanders' ancestors inspire artwork. The statue of Mary near the altar of the church resembles a Maui, and the symbol of the Holy Trinity is not a dove, but rather a Manotora, a bird that was considered sacred during the 19th century. Similarly, the stained glass windows favor imagery that is locally inspired. This attempt of Christian believers on Rapa Nui to make Christian faith relevant by assimilating local culture into art and religious traditions is a very concrete example of contextualizing the traditional Western faith experience. Some would argue that this approach builds bridges and is an inclusive way of helping unify communities spiritually. Others would say that it is only a means to an end, the majority faith seeking to gain converts by evangelicizing a more engaging yet perhaps deceitful way. Still more would say that contextualization runs contrary to the truth and is therefore inappropriate. Within this context, the panelists are asked to consider the following questions. First of all, what experiences do you have in contextualizing faith in your tradition? Secondly, do you think contextualization of faith traditions is important, especially in the non-Western environment? And finally, can contextualization go too far? With those thoughts in mind, I'm going to turn back to those that started our conversation today. Mel.
Yes, contextualization can go too far, and there are a variety of instances where it has. But I would say to help us understand what contextualization is, my wife has a collection of nativity sets. They come from all over the world. She probably has 150 because every time I take a trip, I bring one home that's from a different place. And they're made out of different elements, and they represent the culture in which these people live. So if you have a Native American one, it looks like American Indians. If you have one from Tanzania or Kenya, it will have Africans. We have one from Hawaii, which has people in leis and skirts. And we also have one from Alaska with Eskimos and an igloo instead of a manger and so forth. So, it's an attempt by people to say, to embrace the message of the gospel, the message of the nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ in their culture. And I don't think there's any problem with that. If you think about also the fact that when Jesus talked to the people in Israel at the time that he lived there, we have him using agrarian language because most people were farmers, and he uses fisherman's language when he calls his disciples and so forth. There's this language that is common to the culture. So when we're talking about contextualization of faith or contextualization of proclaiming the gospel, we need to think seriously about how do we communicate the gospel to the culture in language that they can understand. And I think that's really important for us to do that. Otherwise, the message can be lost. But the message can also be lost if we assimilate too much to culture and allow the culture to determine how the text or how the gospel should be read and understood. And that's often a difficult thing. And I would say that it borders then on what we would call syncretism. We've talked about contextualization as potentially a good thing, assimilation, which could be good or bad depending upon the culture and what it demands, but also syncretism, which can be a very negative thing. I do have a friend. He's now dead, but he was a professor at the University of Birmingham, and he used to say, Mel, every church, every religious community is involved in syncretism of one kind or another. Now, those of us in the West, those who are Euro-American, we don't think about syncretism. We don't think about why we do certain kinds of things because it's come down to us in our culture.
So, Mark, could you just define syncretism for everybody?
Well,
in case,
yeah, surely. Syncretism, I would say, is you take something and maybe there's a culture that's not good. Well, let me say it this way. When Americans imported African slaves into the United States, the requirement was, in the Louisiana region, you make them Catholic within 8 days. You must baptize them as Catholic in 8 days. If you do not do that, you lose your slaves to the government. Okay, that's the way it was set up. That was what they call Code Noir. Slaves didn't easily convert from their religion in Africa to the Catholic religion. And what they did instead was they put the names of their gods and so forth in the names of the saints. So when you were praying to Mary or when you were praying to Philip or you were praying to some other saint, you would be thinking of a different god. Okay, so that's not a good thing. Okay, you're not really contextualizing. You are importing something new and ultimately, in certain cases, it ends up in kind of spiritualism, and voodoo, and many of what they call cargo cults, which has a lot of syncretistic things. So I think it's really important for us to understand that contextualization is a good thing because what it does is it helps us to communicate the gospel in language that people understand. I would say this statement that it can be deceitful is a possibility, but I don't think real contextualization is deceitful. It's very clear on what the gospel message is.
Thank you. Rabbi.
Well, I share many of the sentiments about the positive elements of contextualization or assimilation of the broader culture into what a religious tradition teaches. A few weeks ago, we celebrated the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder is a ritual that's modeled off a Greek and Roman symposium. There's so much written in the Talmudic tradition about the tension between how much do we borrow from the Hellenistic culture that was so much part of the mainstay of normal life in Roman Judea 2,000 years ago, and how much should we keep that away because it can draw people away from the core truths. And that question of to what degree is assimilation a good thing has bewildered and perplexed the Jewish people through our wanderings through history for 2,000 years. Because we were always the minority culture in the midst of a larger culture, and there was always a question of how much should we draw from the larger culture and how much should we resist assimilation into that larger culture. In some ways, there were wonderful things that happened through that assimilation. In the Middle Ages, Maimonides integrated Aristotelian logic into Jewish philosophy and theology in ways that made it possible for whole new ways for people to appreciate their tradition and God based on the larger cultures in which they live. Similar things happen in the course of Jewish mystical evolution. And at the same time, there was a disturbing study that came out a little over 30 years ago that was called the National Jewish Population Study. And what it found was at that time something that no one would have ever imagined would have come to pass, which was there was a 52% intermarriage rate. Now, for millennia, Jews only believed in endogamous marriage, Jews marrying other Jews, partly because no one wanted to marry us. And they forbade their kids from marrying Jews. And so Jews kept to themselves in their own communities, their own villages, and in larger cultures in their own ghettos and maintained their own practice. Through the process of the Enlightenment, Jews started to integrate into the larger world in Europe and certainly in North America. And you started seeing ways in which we began to adapt our practice to the larger cultures in which we live. We changed the architecture of our synagogues from having the reading stand in the middle to in the front, so it more modeled what a church looked like. We added elements from the broader secular or even Christian musical tradition by bringing in an organ and a choir. And as things have evolved, there's always been this sort of pendulum shift between, well, how much do I tack toward tradition and how much do I adapt to the world in which I live? And in some ways, you've seen these extraordinary explosions of new creativity because of the ways in which we've interacted and adapted from the larger cultures. And at the same time, there is this persistent fear that those new introductions aren't authentic, and an even greater fear that that assimilation will be a doorway out of religious practice as opposed to a magnet to draw people in.
Thank you. Tom, do you have anything to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I think the importance of this conversation is for all of us to understand that the truth is that faith permeates the world and the human experience. It is psychologically important to us to understand something more than just us and more than just our what we can grasp by our reason. It's psychologically important to us. It helps to form us. It gives us an ethical compass. And so there is, religions have been found throughout the world. Wherever we've explored and found new groups of folks tucked away, even today, in some jungle place that nobody gets very often, we find them having religion, having some sort of faith experience. To me, what you're talking about, Mel, in terms of contextualization is simply granting the humanity of the person that you're going to and sit and enough to sit down and talk with them about their faith experience and trying to discover then where God is leading us from where we are, our two different and sometimes clashing cultures and experiences of the holy, where that might be leading us for the future. But a perfect example of how this has been damaging is the Constantinian takeover of Christianity in the the late 3rd and early 4th century, when there was then the subjugation of women who had been in leadership in the earliest church, the loss of pacifism, which I think it was pretty clear in the early church coming out of the teachings of Jesus. And those kinds of things, not to mention the leadership structure, which became controlling rather than pastoral, and those kinds of things that where the mix became something that caused a lessening of the faith, a radical change of the faith into something that it had not been before.
I think that this is a very interesting conversation. The question that comes to my mind is really, Rabbi, with your counter-statement at the very beginning, identity. With all of this happening and the positives surrounding it, how do we make sure that identity of our faith, of our religion, actually stays core? And I suppose part of that conversation is an even more difficult one, is who decides what that identity is and what is core to it. Constantine, okay, so he brought changes. Did that lose the identity of the Christian church at that point? Was that identity lost somehow? Did it shift? So I think that whole thing about how
or was it warped?
Or was it warped? Yeah. So how do we maintain that core identity without denying the reality of the context of the world around us?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that there can be dangerous responses to the natural trend towards contextualization. So there's I think the way in which some have chosen to respond is to turn towards a strong fundamentalist, anti-modern, ghettoized version of life. So in Jewish tradition, you have what are called Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews that literally wall themselves off from the modern world in which they live. They don't teach their kids normal secular subjects except to the bare minimum. They don't speak in modern language. They speak in Yiddish, even though Hebrew is a modern language, and so is English. They live in upstate New York, but they tack towards, they sort of regress because they're so afraid of the imposition of that larger culture into their belief systems that they wall themselves off. I don't think that that's useful. I think that what's helpful is to realize that there are many different portals of entry to access divine truth. And some of them are found from within one's own faith tradition. But as evidence of 70 years of this program, there's a lot to be found in drawing on and learning from the cultures that surround us and the belief systems of other peoples. And sometimes you can learn enough from them that you say, you know what, that actually helps me understand better how I want to practice my own faith tradition. And those emendations or contextualizations make people's faith and participation and connection stronger.
Right.
I was thinking the Constantinian question is a very important question, I think, because it really did radically change Christianity, at least the trappings of it, and how it was run and so forth. But I don't think it changed the essence of Christianity. In other words, the message has stayed the same, so that from the 1st century to the 21st century, we basically have the same common statement of what the faith consists of. And, it's found in the creeds, that most churches will confess. Now, I realize yours is a non-creedal group, and mine essentially is, although yes and no, okay? But the point is, our point would be, the creed can become just as meaningless as anything else, and so why do that? But if you take that apart, and each part of that creed, you take it and say, do we believe this? They would answer, yes, we do, okay? So I think that's really important. I was thinking about music. Music is a great place to look at contextualization, how our church has changed from the hymns that used to have lots of theology in them. People who sang those hymns would know what we believe, to the choruses that we have today in our churches, which are mostly all praise choruses, or it's I feel so good, kind of stuff. And I look at that and say, now the culture, I think, we have pulled it in too far, and as a result, we're losing a lot of what we understood to be the core of the gospel, simply because we don't have a space for it.
Great, thank you. Excellent thoughts. Let's have a break.
We hope you're enjoying today's program. If you'd like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the vision and history of the program, and we invite you to become a ministry partner, explore our Town Hall Estates healthcare facilities, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, we look forward to receiving your letters. You may write us at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. If you have a prayer request, please send it to prayerrequest@americanreligious.org. Thank you for writing and thank you for watching. Now, back to today's closing statements.
Welcome back, everybody, and thank you again for joining us today for this intriguing conversation about contextualization. We're now going to move to our closing statements from our panelists. Mel.
Yeah, I think I went a little bit long on that last statement, and I'm not wanting to say I want to return to hymns, only to hymns. I do think there's some value in the contextualization of the music that we have and the way it's done. Although I do think in some places it is too much culture and not enough of faith, in a sense. But what I would say is that it is very important that we contextualize whatever the message is that we have. Otherwise, we simply cannot communicate what's important to us as a faith tradition about what to expect from God, what God might expect from us, and how we might live in the world around us as a result of the faith tradition.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to take my closing comment in a different direction. One of the great problems, I think, with Christian evangelization throughout history is that we have tended to forget when we encounter other cultures that God's already been there with those people. And those other people have had and made some sense of it. And what is called contextualization is simply being willing to sit with my faith in conversation with someone else's and asking then not which is better, but where does God now lead us from here? And this approach can more successfully, I think, promote human rights, because it begins by granting the humanity of the other person. It also makes religion a force for peace in this world rather than a cause for conflict, which it has too often been.
Thank you.
So in Jewish tradition, especially in our contemporary period, there's this grand tussle about assimilation. And so if you go to a worship service as an American Jew, that's all in Hebrew. For many people, that's a terribly alienating experience because they don't understand the language of what's being offered. But then there's others that say, well, if we add English to our prayers and start singing in English as well, is that just sort of an easy off-ramp to alleviate people of the responsibility of learning Hebrew and being literate in their tradition? Because Hebrew is the language that unites the Jewish people from around the world. And the question is, yeah, kind of both, right? So there are people in my congregation who, even if I beg them on hands and knees, I need you to become literate in Hebrew, they're never going to be literate in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And what's more important, that they be literate in Hebrew, or that they feel that through an English interpretation of what Jewish tradition is trying to express, they're able to build a connection to God through the corpus of their tradition, even in translation? Or maybe through the inspiration that only English or rock and roll can provide, that other contexts of Jewish music or expression are not able to provide. And I think it's always the same. There's always this question of balance, of making sure that one is adhering to some sense of integrity from what is the core of what their religious tradition teaches, while at the same time approaching the larger cultures in which we live with curiosity to say, what do you have to teach me, and what might I integrate into my understanding of my tradition that can help me build a stronger connection to God and a stronger connection to the people with whom I share my faith?
Thank you. So it's interesting, in our conversation we have really moved in a range of different directions, from identity that relates more to maybe what I call core theology or core belief, and moving towards more, I'd say, the trappings like music. But is music trappings, or is it core to identity? I don't know that any of us have all the answers here. I think just that importance of that balance. I'll tell you one experience I had. I was in Africa, actually in Cameroon, and there were two church services, one after the other. It was on a university campus, and I was speaking at one of them, and I stayed to the second one. The first one was a community service, and the choir came in, and they all were playing local instruments, and they were moving to the music. And I've got to say, our denomination doesn't move a lot to music, but they were moving to music. There was energy. They were sitting there, they were singing. The whole environment of it was a buzz of what I would say cultural connection. The next service, they had a piano singing. The choir came in. They stood in one place. They sang very traditional hymns. You stand back afterwards and say, okay, was one better than the other? Probably not. But one definitely connected more to the culture, and the other connected more to the traditional identity. And I think that's what we were about there. When we talk about contextualization, we are trying to make whatever our faith or faith group is relevant to the local community. But it's just that need to just take a bit of care. How are we doing it? When does it go too far? The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but also in reality. And so now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.